almost forgot. And we'll get started. And so I'm Denise Presnell. I've been a school social worker in this school system for 27 years. I also am the lead for WCCI, Watauga Compassionate Community Initiative, which is our grassroots organization for turning Watauga into a trauma-informed community. And I'm gonna let Lindsay introduce herself, and then we're just gonna have a conversation. And as we've done in the past, don't wait for us to take a breath, because I rarely do. So you're welcome. Don't raise your hand because I may not see you, but just unmute yourself, and we welcome any comments or thoughts or questions that you may have. So Lindsay, I'll let you tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Lindsay Sullivan. I work at the public health department here at Healthcare. So I work in community health on the P Positive Parenting Grant. And my background is family support, community health. I just got my master's in social work in May, had a baby in July, and then started this position in September. So 2020 was a big year on many fronts.
Thanks, Lindsay. So just a little background. Through several conversations with different people, we've been talking about that we never will just want to talk about trauma, that we also want to talk about resilience. Because trauma, we can't change what's happened to us, but we can build our resilience. And so really trying to put as much focus on the resilience part as the trauma part. And so then we started planning the WCCI Wednesday conversations and thought it'd be a good place and a safe environment for some of us who come from trauma to talk about that. And as we began planning those, it's been really interesting that the people doing the sessions, every single one of them, without talking to each other, said they're doing it for two reasons. So that people from trauma know they're not alone, because it's so isolating. And so people who aren't from trauma can better understand how people from trauma sometimes interpret things and how it puts a lens on everything that we do, that we interpret things through our trauma history, unless we do a lot of work around that. And so then Jennifer Warren, oh, she's here. Jennifer Warren mentioned to me one time something that Dr. Nadine Burke Harris had said about faces of ACES. And I was like, I love that, because I think, and it's been my experience in training people about trauma, that people want to be able to look at somebody and go, oh, they come from trauma and there's this much of it. They want it to be some kind of visible red flags, boxes we can check about they're dirty and they look high and their clothes aren't clean. And so I just think it's a really powerful thing that we can say, you can't tell by looking at someone. And that we stress a lot in talking to people in the school about universal precautions and treating everybody as if they come from trauma, because it doesn't hurt the people who don't, and it can help heal the people who do. So thinking about that Faces of ACES thing, getting really excited about that. And then talking with some different groups of WCCI planning, and again, wanting the focus to be on both the resilience and the trauma. So we added the Thriving Lives part of that title, that we wanted to do a series of Faces of ACES, Thriving Lives, where people can talk about not only a small part of their past, because as Lindsay and I were talking about this, Lindsay, you jump in whenever you want to. I said to Lindsay, there's no way to actually share your story with somebody. The amount of chaos and violence that would happen, I'll speak for myself in my life, in 15 minutes could be a conversation for a week or more, because it's just, there's so much chaos that goes on. And so not sharing really explicit details so much as just kind of a general overview of trauma, the trauma that's happened to us, but with as much focus on what were the things that changed our lives, because I get that question a lot. What made the difference for you? What changed your path? And then also how we stay well, which is a really big struggle sometimes. So I've kind of put out an all call for Faces of ACES Thriving Lives, people who are willing to share. And Lindsay reached out and said, would like to talk more about this. Most of the people who have responded to me said, can we talk more about this? So we started talking, and we actually had 2 conversations, I think. And I didn't know much about Lindsay, had never really talked to her. And I think this is why this is so critical for us, is that everything we were saying to each other resonated with us and we could relate to it. One of the first things she said to me was, it's really hard to know how much of your trauma to disclose, because you don't know if you're going to get like shock from the people listening, or if they're going to turn around and walk away, if they won't know what to do with it. So having a safe place to be able to say, yes, this is what happened to me, but it's not my identity, it's not my destiny. And this is what you can learn from that, I think is really important to all of us who have a trauma history. Lindsay, is you anything you want to add to that?
No, I'll just say, you know, I was really struggling with how to do this. I knew I had a story to share. And when I came to you, I was like, so what if there's a conversation between 2 people with ACEs? Because it is such a vulnerable thing, and it's hard to find resolution in sharing these parts of your story, because it's hard to know what you want from sharing your story, or at least it is for me. And so Denise was like, well, I think I have a person in mind, and we just kind of talked about doing it together, which I am so pleased that Denise decided to do this with me. And Denise, I really appreciate you coming along for the ride with me.
Oh gosh, thank you. What an honor and a privilege. And as we were talking, me and Lindsay, I realized when we were kind of brainstorming who might she partner with, I thought, how can I ask people to share their story if I'm not willing to show that same vulnerability? So here we are. And we're going to talk a little bit about our past, but with a bigger focus on some of those impacts that we carry with us, and just some of the things we continue to wrestle with. And so just really briefly, as far as trauma history goes, if you know what the ACES survey is, there's 10 things on the ACES survey: physical, emotional, sexual abuse, emotional, physical neglect, parent with a mental illness, a parent with an addiction, a parent who's been incarcerated, witnessing your mother be physically abused, and divorce. And the range of the impact of those depends on so many things: how chronic and pervasive it is, the age of the trauma, if you've had multiple traumas, your own personality. And what they've come to find out since then is that there's so many more things that are traumatic: community violence, war, disaster, accidents, chronic medical illnesses, peer victimization, and bullying. But that's our basic, the original 10. And so most of us have had at least one ACE, something like 60%. And then about 15% of us have had 4 or more. And once you start building up after 4, then the impacts expound. And so they affect more areas of your life in deeper ways. And so more than 4 is when you start talking about higher risks for homelessness and joblessness and addiction and mental illness and being a victim or perpetrator of domestic violence. So what I will say, we decided we didn't want to get into a whole lot of the details of it, but I'll say that my ACES score is a 9 out of 10, and that the only thing that I didn't experience was physical neglect. I was fed and clothed. And so I was one of those kids who looked like to everybody that I was normal, because I looked like everybody thought I was supposed to look like. And so a lot of people didn't have any idea about what was going on at my house. And so, Lindsay, what would you like to say about your trauma history or your ACES score?
Yeah, so much of the adversity I faced was around household dysfunction, so untreated mental illness, untreated addiction, violence in the home, divorce, There was incarceration of multiple relatives for everything from drug charges to homicide. There was adversity, like you mentioned, that wasn't mentioned on the questionnaire. And I know we talked about this at WCCI a lot. Abandonment of a parent, death of a parent, in my case, tragically to suicide, although that happened after I was 18. But yeah, very generational trauma, complex, very layered.
Thanks for sharing those details, Lindsay. So when Lindsay and I were talking, we were talking about why we would want to share this and have this conversation. And one of the things that we kind of touched on already is that it's just, when you live in trauma, it's very isolating. You feel like you're the only one. At least for me, I thought there can't be anybody else who's having to live through what I'm having to live through, because it's just, nobody would even believe if I tried to tell them the story. And so trying to build community around trauma history is one really important thing. I think that we both agreed was something that we really wanted to try to do.
Yeah, it's interesting in that first meeting with you. I think you also mentioned that Tom had said this to you, like nobody would believe. If I told somebody what happened to me, they wouldn't believe that, because the stories are just so much to process. And I think that definitely is a barrier to sharing. And something else that we had talked about was, there never seems to be a good time to share. Like, am I going to casually tell my friends over dinner that all these awful things happened to me? Like, when are you supposed to share these things? And one of the things I mentioned to you first when we talked was, I have really good friends who have no idea the extent of my trauma because of that, because there just doesn't seem to be a time or an appropriate space to have those conversations. And so, yeah, that's definitely a reason to share, because you think about that and it's like, if I have good friends who don't know the extent of what I've been through, then the amount of people we come across on a daily basis that we have no idea.
Yeah. And when we talk about the prevalence, and like even back then in the 90s, when that study was done, that 1 in 4 people have had at least one traumatic experience as a child. And so when you look, for example, at this call where 40 people are, and we're talking at least 10 of us have had at least one, and then 15% of us have had 4 or more. So it's interesting to me that trauma and trauma experiences can make your brain believe that there's nobody else like this. And I think that's a really debilitating part of the experiences, is that you think you're the only one. Another thing that we talked about that I wanted to be sure and mention is, when you're talking about how does trauma look, then we were started talking about how does normal look, and how when I'm in a crowd, everybody looks normal to me. And I stand, even at my age, 52, I'm 30 years past a lot of my trauma. Wondering, it's still prevalent in my mind when I'm in a crowd of, have these people been through trauma? If so, they look so normal. I know I must look normal. Wonder how hard they had to fight to get where they look normal now and can, socialize in public without bringing it up. And so just how even years and years later, it continues to be a part of our consciousness, even in groups where we're doing these comparison things that don't make it as easy as I feel like sometimes other people have it.
Yeah, and then at the same time, it's like, I am always thinking someone's going to figure me out. Like, it's thinking, I must look normal too, and looking around and wondering what normal is and comparing, and this feeling of like, have they figured it out yet that I don't fall in this category, which, is how many people actually can fall into that category. And I know everyone has something somewhere down the line, but yeah, definitely a feeling of being separate from everybody else in a way.
And then we didn't talk about this. This just occurred to me. The message at my house, and I think at a lot of houses when I was growing up, is we don't talk about this stuff. Even when people are being arrested in public in front of lots and lots of other people, we still don't talk about it. And so I think that's a filter that I still try to get through. And I know even when I mention it casually in a group, as soon as that moment's over, I'm going, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe that's going to change how somebody thinks of me professionally. Maybe they're not going to understand. Maybe they think I'm doing it for attention. You know, all these thoughts running through my head about, even though it's maybe a sentence, I probably shouldn't have disclosed that. And now I kind of regret that I do. So being able to sit and be okay and comfortable with, you know, the sharing of, not only the trauma, but the impacts is difficult.
Yeah.
And so we talked a little bit about that feeling of being different. And we talked about when we're in a crowd, what would the reaction be? One thing that I have mentioned before in an interview that Brittany Craven, who I think is here, did with me, is how it changes our perception of the world. And so for me, I've always had this warrior mentality, and I thought that I was born that way. And it was something that it was just an inherent part of my nature. And when I started learning about trauma stuff 4 or 5 years ago, it's only been in the past couple of years that I realized that maybe I wasn't born that way, that maybe that's what they made me into. And so, once I got over the shock of that, just the freedom of that may not be an identity that I have to carry with me the rest of my life, that I get to choose. Maybe that's not my inherent personality. But for years and years and years, that was the lens that I saw everything through and perceived everything as a potential threat. And when we're talking in schools and teachers are like, I don't know what happened. I just looked at him and he lost it. Or, you know, I just asked her to move to the back of the line. I can really relate to that because I perceived everything as a potential safety issue or potential threat. So really how different I think our perceptions are of just mundane types of interactions and where we're trying to assess what the threat is to us. So that was another thing that we had talked about how it changes how we perceive things.
Yeah, and it's interesting you saying that about this identity of being a warrior. I was thinking about this identity of me being an introvert and how much of that is actually my temperament and how much of that is very much so a coping mechanism, you know, retreating inward and kind of blocking people out, disconnecting. You know, there's definitely elements of that come from trauma, but it's easier just to kind of say, oh, I'm an introvert.
Yeah, I think it's both scary and exciting to me that it may not be my nature, that it's possible that I can be somebody else. So that kind of scares me because everything I've done for my whole life has been from a warrior standpoint. And so that I could maybe choose to do something else is both scary and exciting. So I'm still learning to sit with that and think about who I might want to be instead. So, so let's talk about how it impacts relationships. Because both of us, when we talk about positive, safe, caring, consistent relationships, we have a similarity in that for both of us as our spouse. And I met my husband when I was 24. And besides my husband's parents, not my husband, my dad's parents who lived in another city that I didn't get to spend much time with, they were very positive, consistent, caring people, but they were probably the only ones until I met my husband at 24. So I had been doing this a really long time by myself. And I remember this is, again, when I say this, I feel like it sounds so crazy, but we were never on time at my house growing up. We frequently missed entire events, or we would go in 30 minutes late so we didn't hear what was going on or being said or the directions or what we're supposed to do or the getting to know you part. And then we were late being frequently when we got picked up. And so when my husband showed up for our first date 5 minutes early, I didn't even know that that was a possibility in human nature. I was like, oh my God, you can get somewhere early? Like that was completely foreign to me. I didn't know it existed. And so he has been my positive, consistent, safe, caring adult for me. And so I think that's true for you. Who are your positive, consistent, caring adults?
Yeah, definitely Seth. Yeah, Seth, our relationship has been so healing to me, and part of that is he's always willing to do the work. So we've been seeing a counselor together since before we got married. He works really hard to be trauma informed, to try and understand what I've been through and how my brain functions, and you know, the right and wrong thing to do or say in any given moment. And I think kind of just bringing me back to earth a little bit sometimes. And that's an ongoing effort for sure. And when we're talking about how it affects relationships, you know, there's so many things that come up that we continue to learn about and how we relate to each other. And one, I think I told you something that came up recently is we were having a spirited conversation, if you will, and I realized that I didn't want him blocking the doorway, or I didn't want him too close to me. And I think in the past I would have been more reactive without realizing that that was triggering me. And I just kind of picked up on that, and I was like, can you move over there and back up a little bit? And he's able to be more conscious of those little things. And that was something that happened, you know, a few months ago. It was something that I learned would help me in moments of conflict. So it's this ongoing learning experience between the two of us.
And we had that early in our relationship. I don't think I've told many people this, but my husband was the first person that had not been in, that I dated or spent time with, that had not been in jail, was not either physically or emotionally abusive, and who was kind to me. And so it was about 2 years of almost daily panic attacks where I would all of a sudden, we'd just be in a car and I'd be like, I got to get out. And we'd be moving. And so he'd be like, everything's fine. You're okay. There's nothing happening here. There's no threat to you. As soon as he could, he'd pull over and be like, okay, let's talk about what's going on. And I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't been ready to sit with that, because it was so terrifying to me. The absence of violence was so terrifying to me. And so it took a couple of years of him being able to just be fully present and sit with that and just, you know, tell me I was going to be all right before that started subsiding a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, a lot of credit to, when we're talking about, it's not just for people from trauma who feel isolated, but also so much for people who aren't from trauma, because those tend to be, you know, our positive, consistent, caring adults. And there's people on this call who, from WCCI, who have become my positive, consistent, caring adults. And I'll talk to them about how I can feel the part of my brain that was engineered in trauma when I'm trying to make a new pathway from something that's positive and healthy. I literally feel the new parts of my brain like bumping in to the old parts. And I'm like, you know, this old part of my brain wants to react like this. And this new part of my brain is telling me that there's other choices that I can make. And it is the most bizarre feeling to have that going on in my head.
Yes. And it's, you know, there's, especially if you've been gaslighted as part of your trauma at all, it can be really disorienting, because there's part of me that's like, it's hard for me to know what's real because of my trauma. But then I don't want to question my reality all the time, because that's a result of being gaslighted all the time. And how completely confusing that is, of wanting to trust my instincts and my perception as a point of growth, but also wanting to, I guess, check those those instincts and perceptions against my trauma. And the only way I figured out to do that is having those adults who can be like, yeah, okay, this is what's happening, I'm with you, and can hold me kind of accountable and help ground me in reality.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about, we're grown-ups. So imagine children who are still living in their trauma or their violence and being expected to sit in a chair and learn new things and complete their work and write on the line and put their name on paper, all the things that we expect kids to be able to do when they have all this same stuff going on in their heads. And so just trying to help us remember that when kids are currently living in trauma, what a huge deal it is for them to be able to meet the expectations that people have of them. One thing we want to talk about is how it impacts us at work. I laugh when I tell this, but I don't know how funny it is. But when the pandemic hit, I was like, this is what I was engineered in. This level of chaos, this feels normal to me. Like, I know what to do here. Like, for 6 months of the first 6 months of the pandemic, I was good to go. Like, I felt like somebody flipped a switch, and yeah, I can stay in my house for months at a time. I don't need food or toilet paper. Like, this is how I was raised. And so it literally was about August when I finally started going, oh yeah, this doesn't actually feel good to me anymore. This has gone on way too long. But, and then when I came back to work, I literally felt like I had gone to work for a new company because I didn't know the answers to anything. And so it took me a while of work is where I feel the most competent. And all of a sudden I didn't know the answers to anything. And I walked around and I would tell parents, like, I don't know. I might have to find out because I don't know. And so you talked a little bit about how triggering work has been for you as well. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think stress at work has always been a trigger for me. I think I'm thinking back to jobs I had when I was 16 and I was having a panic attack behind the counter at Panera. Like it took me a lot longer to recognize work as a place where I could experience triggers than any other place of my life, I would think. It took me a long time to recognize that. And I still manage to convince myself every once in a while that it's no longer an issue and I've got it under control, which I know you and I have talked about. We love to think that we're done with our trauma and everything's resolved. But perfectionism is a huge thing that pops up for me professionally. I have to laugh at the fact that I work in public health right now. There is no option for being a perfectionist right now. Like, you either have to get over yourself quick or the train's leaving without you, because public health is, there's not the space for it right now. So it's funny to me. It's a good opportunity for me, and I'm like really forcing myself to say that, to learn in the environment that is public health right now, how to let a lot of that go. And that's an ongoing effort for me. But I think, being conscious of boundaries. I have to be extra conscious of boundaries in the workplace, not overcompensating or overextending myself or offering to do everything. And I think a lot of that, I try to have a lot of accountability around that as well. So like whether it's trusted colleagues or fellow social workers, outside of the agency I work for, my therapist, of course, lots and lots of accountability.
Well, and we talked some about how self-care feels like one more added responsibility, one more thing that we're not doing well. And I see Mary McKinney here. She talked with us before about relational care and how much we need to support each other, how helpful it is to have someone to prompt us or support us in taking good care of ourselves. And you spoke about Seth being like, I think you maybe could benefit from a walk, or do you need to go somewhere and take a minute? And so having people help us with that. And one of the things that I've started doing to help people with their boundaries and to recognize it for myself is thanking people for telling me no. And I have become so aware of how terrified people are to tell me no. I was talking with a business guy one day and I asked him for something and he emailed me back later and he said, we thought long and hard about it and I'm just so sorry we can't do that. And I wrote him back and said, I appreciate, you know, the burdens and responsibilities that you carry. And he wrote me back and said, I've never had someone respond to me telling them no with anything but like resentment. And so even when it's something small, like I recently asked the principal at Parkway to do a session for us at the conference, and she's like, I really want to, and I just can't. And I said, I'm so proud of you for saying no. When I see someone eating and they're not on the phone or with a client, like I was eating the last 3 minutes before we came on here, and telling them, you know, good job that you're eating somewhere where you cannot be disturbed. And so trying to recognize that in other people and encourage that, you know, to say no and to take care of yourself and to stop when you need to and to take care of your own needs, because it's been amazing how people are not comfortable with that. So we talked about work. Let's talk some about parenting. And you mentioned a few minutes ago how we love to have the fantasy that we'll get done with this trauma work and not have to deal with it anymore. Because how unfair is that, that you have to keep processing it for the rest of your life? And I mentioned to you that I did therapy when I was about 20, and I thought I was done. And then I did therapy when I had my first child for a couple of years, thought I was done. Did therapy again when I had my second child and thought I was done. And I happened to be in therapy again. And so it's been so interesting to me the way a trauma history and trauma experiences means something different at each point. Like it meant something different to me as a wife, and it meant something different to me as the mom of a son, and it meant something to me as the mom of a daughter, and now it means something to me as the mom of a 17-year-old. And so at all these different developmental phases, I guess it is, I find myself having to revisit, and you and I talked about, it seemed bad to me at the time. And then I got a 14-year-old and thought about all the things that had been done to me at 14. And I was like, oh my God, it's so much worse because now I have a 14-year-old to compare it to. And so just how we continue to try to process it and put it where it needs to be and assimilate it into our life in a way that feels healthy.
Yeah. I remember I was talking about how trying to parent with trauma is like you always have to have your trauma just close enough so you're not making the same mistakes, projecting that trauma, all that fun stuff, but not too close that you're sick and miserable all the time. And we were saying how exhausting it is to hold that tension all of the time of like keeping it close but not too close, and this kind of dance you do with your trauma present every day through every decision you make, through every connection with your child. It takes so much work, and is more and more apparent to me now that I am a parent. I've been passionate about supporting parents for a long time, but you know, of course, G is just like, as soon as I became a parent, I was like, oh boy, here we go. I knew it was coming, but I was like, here we go, okay. And you know, we all talk about how incredibly hard it is to be a parent, but if you come from trauma and you're having to hold that tension all of the time of keeping your trauma just there, I mean, it's exhausting. It's a lot. And how much, it just puts so much into perspective for me as to why we have to support parents.
Yeah. And I remember how relieved I was when I heard you talking about that, because so I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old, and I say I was raised by wolves and no one knew where I was or the state I was in or anything. And so all I knew to do was do the exact opposite of what was done to me. And my first child responded really well to that because he's kind of got a warrior mentality as well. And so he was like, okay, but my second child did not respond well to that. And so I was like, well, I've got this that I know I shouldn't do, and this, which is the exact opposite. And now I'm not sure what else there is. And so having to relearn all that stuff. And when I have told my therapist this, I feel like I'm parenting her, which is hard enough. She's a 17-year-old adolescent. And the entire time, my entire trauma history is right here. And I'm either wishing that what I was doing had happened to me then, or wondering why it didn't, or what would have been different if it had. So we've got this real life thing happening here, and then all this shadow stuff over here. And I thought that I was probably crazy because it was so present and right there. And when you said that, I was like, oh, good. I'm not the only one, thank goodness, because I'm the only one I've ever heard have that experience.
Yeah, and I something in talking to you, and something I continue to become more and more passionate about, is how important it is for parents with ACEs to talk to each other about what it's like to be a parent with ACEs, because it's such a unique experience, or at least it feels that way. Again, coming back to that feeling of isolation, like trying to be a normal parent, or questioning every decision you make because you've got that trauma sitting there next to you. That kind of peer support between parents with ACEs, and all of the complexities that come with trying to parent with trauma in your history.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's talk some about how we stay well. And as we were talking about this, a lot of the other people who have done this had these beautiful lists that I envy and admire about getting lots of rest and taking walks and all those concrete physical activities. But you and I really started talking, and we both immediately went towards this mindset of how we try to stay well. And so one of the biggest things, hold on, sorry.
Yeah.
1 second.
Be safe.
I can't get where they are. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure everybody, if you're not muted, which most people are, just one person, if you could mute yourself for me, please. Thanks. I'm so easily distracted. So one of my biggest thing is that I have to recognize when I've had enough, and then also stop. Because I not only tend to agree to everything and want to help everybody, but I tend to have like 9 massive major things going on in my life, and I try to do them all to the best of my ability every day. And so really it is more of a mindset of making sure that I rest and stop when my brain needs to. I'm in a program right now where I have homework. And so I'll work a full day at a school as a social worker in a pandemic, and then go home and try to do homework and be paying attention to when my brain says, you can't do this right now. I can't process the written word, and taking care of myself like that. And so we talked to each other about some of those, how sometimes we don't feel normal, like we're doing a good job. And so we have to act as if we believe it's true. They sometimes feel like we're fake, an imposter or a fake, and just ourselves that we are doing okay, and that we're doing what we need to do, and that accepting kind of the things that we've done today is enough. So some other thoughts that you have about ways you stay well?
Yeah, I feel like when I think about the things that are have the biggest effect, the first things I think of are the things I take away that make me feel well. So, sobriety as of recent years has been a big part of my treatment plan. staying away from things. I know I told you this is kind of a random one, I guess, but staying away from social media. I don't have social media. Staying off of the news, not watching like movies and things that are upsetting to me. It's like so much of me staying well is taking out any variables that complicate my already complicated brain. It's like, what are the things I can't afford to have in my life right now? Substances I can't afford to have in my life. Social media, I just don't have the capacity. And that's such a huge part of wellness for me, as opposed to all of the things. It's like all of the extra things that you do to take care of yourself in your very limited time. It's like, well, actually, there's a lot that I do that is not doing things,
When we're talking about not doing things, I told you, I assumed that everybody's brain was weak to like influence, and that I was talking to a friend of mine once years ago, and he was telling me about a horror movie or something that he'd watched, and I was like, did you feel the portal opening up? And he looked at me like I was crazy, and he was like, what are you talking about? And I said, I can't watch stuff like that because I literally feel the portal opening up and things trying to pull me down. And he clearly could not, I don't think he came from drama, and he clearly couldn't relate to that. But it is, you and I were talking, weakness is not the right word, but there's places in my brain that feel vulnerable to influence, that I have to be really careful about what I surround myself with, because I have a tendency towards isolation and darkness and hopelessness and fear and anxiety. And so I have to be really careful about what I put in my brain, or those tendencies towards that thing, I get pulled that way. And so I like the way you said it about not always things that I do, but things that I don't do, and being careful what I put in my brain. Another thing we talked about was all or nothing thinking, that we have to be perfect in every way all the time for everybody, and trying to relax those standards is one way that we can help ourselves to stay well, giving ourselves some space to not be perfect all the time.
Yeah, I think we were talking about self-care, and it was like, I was thinking, well, here's how my brain likes to sabotage self-care is I will decide I'm going to go for a swim, and if I don't go for a swim 3 days a week for the next 40 years, then it's not even worth it. Like I feel that, the need to have this thing perfectly mapped out, or I shouldn't do it at all. And that is a huge factor that can sabotage self-care for me, rather than just doing the thing that feels good for that moment. I will figure out a way that it's not good enough or right or the right thing for me to do very easily. My brain can go in that direction.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Another thing that I found about wellness is when I'm under a great deal of stress, that's the first thing to go for me. And so like I can develop this nice little routine that's lovely and helps me a whole lot. And I feel really strong and healthy and capable and competent. And the moment one thing totters, I'm like, yep, well, we can't do that, is the first thing that goes. And really, I have to say that's partly the part of me that I the most want to, is to hold my center. No matter what's going on around me, I still feel very susceptible to outside influences when it comes to taking care of myself. So that's something that I would really like to get stronger at. So as we are thinking about starting to wrap up, and if anybody has any questions or comments, we're happy to hear you or answer them. I was kind of thinking about, like, what's our last message of hope? I was talking to Kat Dolan, who was on a Wednesday conversation, and she has the group Out of Your Mind. And she was saying something the other day about being a hope dealer. And I was like, oh, where'd you get that? So she told me this long story about somebody she'd met in Georgia or something who, is doing all this fantastic healing work. And she called herself a hope dealer. And I said, oh, I'll probably have to steal that because I really love that a lot. But as we're talking about wrapping up, messages of hope that we want to give, not only people who are struggling with their own trauma experience, but the people who are able to work with them or care about them or love them or trying to help be that positive, consistent person. So one of the things I thought about was what I said at the beginning, that your trauma doesn't have to be your identity or your destiny. I think that's been a big thing for me, is that brains can heal and change, and that we have choices about who we want to be and what we want our life to be like. So that was one of the things that was important to me to say. Do you have anything that you feel like you would like to give as a message of hope?
Yeah, I think the thing, something that's just kind of come up lately, again, I'm always thinking, partially because I'm a new parent, partially because my background is working with families, but there's a lot of fear because, again, also coming from generational trauma, it's like passing along that trauma, exposing my child to trauma, putting others through what I've been through. And those like relational, generational parts of trauma. And I guess something that was said to me, my therapist said this to me recently, is when I look back at generations before me, there's a lot of grief, and I will forever be processing all of that grief. But I can also find a lot of gratitude, because with every generation, some more space was created for me to get out. And that's enough for me to hold on to, even if my daughter was to feel some residual effects of any of this. There's that much more space that she has to get out, to be well. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Any improvement is valuable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Some of y'all know I've really been struggling with raising one of my children, and I keep saying we did it so much better than like I had a score of 9, she's got a score maybe 2. Like how is it that we still struggle so, that she still struggles so? And I love that it's not the black and white of whether or not we struggle. It's that we have given her more space and more opportunity. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I had something else I was going to say, and that just completely blew my mind. So give me 1 second. I'm going to process that for a second. And so I think for people who are trying to interact with, engage, care about, love people from trauma, one thing that I want to say is how meaningful those interactions and efforts and the reaching out is. Just today, like I'm not used to having people help me carry my stuff or ask me if I'm fine or like what in the world. And just today, 4 different people texted me and are like, I know you're doing the Wednesday conversation. Good luck. We'll be there. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, has this always happened? And I've just been like this resolute, I don't need you. Or is this new because my energy has changed to accept it? And I don't know, but I know that I'm grateful. And somebody said to me, I was doing a WCCI presentation with like the Rotary Club maybe. And after I talked about how relationships heal, this man in the back said, so you're saying if we're nice to people, it will heal their brain. And in that moment, I was like, oh, yes, that is what we're saying. Like every positive interaction heals a part of someone's brain that comes from trauma. And so I just want to reinforce that being fully present and listening. There's several people on this call that I talked to, and I'm like, I don't want you to tell me what to do. I'm just trying to process this with you because I don't know. I know this is my old trauma option, and I'm trying to figure out what the new one is, and I don't know what that is. And so just those positive, caring, consistent interactions, like just show up and be fully present and just listen. That, I think that'd probably be my message for people. Even if you don't come from trauma, you can be part of the healing. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think ending on connection is pretty perfect in my mind.
Awesome. So we've still got a few minutes, and a lot of people are typing things in the chat. And so, Lindsay, I'll send you a copy of that because I know we haven't exactly been reading as we go. If anybody else has a question or something they'd like to say before we sign off. One thing, I'll just remind you that we'll be back here next Wednesday, and that most of our February sessions are going to be Faces of ACES Thriving Lives series. Only one for February in the middle, like the 17th, is the law enforcement panel. But all the rest are Thriving Lives series. So Lindsay, I'm so glad that we did this. We didn't know each other before. I mean, we'd sat at a table for lunch and things like that. We'd done some WCCI work together, but I had no idea of your history or the kind of person that you were or the things that you were struggling with. And so I think that's another good message, is that to find out people's stories, because people often don't have a safe space to share those in. And so to express genuine interest and be able to sit with that, even when it's really hard to hear, can be incredibly powerful for people. So I appreciate so much you being willing to do this with me and sharing your thoughts and your experiences. It's been a genuine pleasure and an honor. And so I'm glad I'm the one you picked. Lindsay was like, wonder who we could get. I'm like, I'll go. So
yes.
Thanks.
I'm thrilled that we were able to work this out. Again, I think, the connection is the kind of the kryptonite to trauma. And so to be able to connect with someone else as I share is that much more powerful. So really cool.
Thanks so much.
Denise,
Yeah.
Brandy Bryson had her hand up that she wanted to say something.
Okay, go ahead, Brandy. I see it now. It's in the top left-hand corner. I didn't see it. Thanks for jumping in.
It's okay. Thank you, Candace. I wanted to ask a question for the both of you, or one of you, if you feel more comfortable answering it. How do you how do I want to articulate this? How do you deal with family and some of the same dysfunctional patterns that really created that trauma that, of course, still lingers, that, of course, we have no control over, other people, right, and their choices, and only our responses. So how do you navigate that? How do you deal with that without just cutting people totally out of your life?
Well, and I think partly because I'll jump in, Lindsay, and then you can say, I think partly because of my personality, I'm totally fine with cutting people off. And I think once I had children, the things I was willing to expose myself to, that I wasn't willing to expose my children to. So some of our relatives, my children have met 4 times. Some of them they've never met. We'll run into somebody somewhere and they'll be like, who is that? And I'm like, my half sister or whatever, because it was imperative to me that I protected them in a way that I wasn't protected. And so to me, it's a continuum from renegotiating boundaries every single time we meet and being clear about what I will and will not accept, and being willing to leave Thanksgiving if it's toxic. And knowing that that may create problems for months to come, but knowing that I'm not going to go through the trauma anymore, to not being around certain members of my family anymore and being okay with that. I'm not a person who thought because I was related to somebody by blood that I had to interact with them on a regular basis for the rest of my life. And I consider that a gift that I feel that way, because I've met people who have been like, oh no, that's my mom, or my dad, I can't cut them out. And I don't feel that way. So that's how I do it. Lindsay, I don't know if there's something you want to add.
Yeah, I love the renegotiating boundaries piece. That's pretty huge. I remember reading somewhere, if you set a boundary and someone pushes back, that's even more evidence that the boundary needed to be set, or a stronger boundary needs to be set. And it's like this game of, okay, I've given my limits, I've set boundaries, and reassessing how much farther we have to go. And there's people in my family that, they're too sick for me to have any relationship. And making peace with that. This is something I had to be reminded of literally 2 days ago, is that that's not my fault. That if someone's sick and we can't have a relationship, it's not as simple as me making a choice to not have that relationship. That choice is made for me, and I had no option. And having folks around me who remind me of that over and over and over again, that it is not a choice I am making, it is a choice that is made for me. Those are for folks that I can't have a relationship with, but otherwise, yeah, renegotiating boundaries over and over again, being conscious of my headspace and when I can talk to whomever. If it's a bad day, the phone is off, yeah, and again, having someone, a therapist, a loved one, a husband who can watch and make sure that I'm advocating for myself where I need to. Somebody else who's willing to be the bulldog if I cannot show up for myself.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brandy. Any other final thoughts before we have to wrap up? And I can't see your hand because I can only see about 4 of you. So if you have something to say, just unmute and jump in. So informal, you're welcome to do that.
Yes, Denise, it's Mary Ann. I was just wondering how the two of you decided, or whoever wants to share on this, to be resilient rather than a victim. What was that pivotal point or points?
I think that's a really interesting question. For me, a thing I don't tell a whole lot of people is that I had a 10-year addiction, that from the time I was 13 years old till I was 23. And I feel like I felt very much like a victim that entire time. That all these things happened to me, that I didn't have any control over, that I really just wanted to escape from without doing the work. And as most people who are in recovery know, I hit a bottom where I was either going to die or I had to get clean. And so I think that part of the consciousness shift from being a victim to taking responsibility, and now it's a passion of mine, like to know my flaws and to take responsibility and to work hard to be a better person every day. So that was the shift for me. But I do think that feeling like a victim and taking responsibility for your choices, whatever they are, is often the difference between staying in pain and creating a more healthy life. Lindsay, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I remember reading something, forever reading, something that explained the difference between self-compassion and self-pity. And when I think of like the victim narrative, and when I get caught in the victim narrative, because I do, it will continue to have my moments of feeling like a victim, is like, okay, well, am I pitying myself or am I being compassionate to myself? And what does that language need to look like to look different? What do I need to tell myself? What does my heart need to hear right now? to give myself some compassion, as opposed to kind of thinking of myself as a victim, because there is such a powerlessness to that story. And I think when you are learning to talk to yourself compassionately, you know, that's the step in between, like feeling like a victim or just get it together, pull up the bootstraps kind of mentality. So I try to reflect on what that sounds like for me, the self-compassionate language.
Thank
Good
you.
question, Mary Ann. So we're going to let y'all go. It's 1, maybe after 1:01, and I want to be respectful of people's time. Thanks so much for being with us today. Lindsay, thank you very much for being willing to do this with me, and hope to see everybody next week. Hope the rest of your day goes well. And don't forget to be a positive, consistent, caring adult for somebody today. So have a good day,
Thanks,
everybody.
y'all.
Take good care.